Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 14th of December 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Apologies for that slight technical glitch there. We'll get straight into things with, of course, Theresa May, desperate for good news at the European Union Council, or the European Council Summit today, after Coleman's blow. That's the headline from Sky News. And later on in the programme with Alex Thompson, I'll be talking about the European Council Summit, which is taking place today and tomorrow. And we'll also be talking about Sky News. But before we get on to that, I'd like to welcome Vanessa Beeley to the programme. Welcome, Vanessa. You're in Lebanon at the moment.
Yeah, I am. Apologies. Internet connection. It seems to be losing it a little bit, but I think it's okay.
I think we'll be fine. We'll be fine. Now, we want to start straight away with the protests that were going on. The protests that were going on in Lebanon on Monday when you arrived. This is your footage, which is on 21st Century Wire at the moment. Just remind us of the background to this, what caused this demonstration, and really what's happened since Monday in Lebanon.
Well, I mean, this was as a result of the President Trump's unilateral decision to declare or to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which, of course, has unleashed fairly strident reactions globally, actually. But this rally in Daya, in the suburb of Beirut, was organized, obviously, by the director of Hezbollah in protest against this move by President Trump. And it was quite an extraordinary rally. I mean, it was certainly one of the most powerful and challenging speeches that I've heard from Nasrallah. I mean, it really set down the ground rules. It basically stated the fact that now terrorism, which is international terrorism, has been defeated pretty much in the region, so in Syria and in Iraq predominantly. Now the priority must once again be Al-Quds and be Palestine. And so this was a call to arms almost for the believers in the resistance, for the believers in the freedom of Palestine. And as I said, it was one of the most powerful and challenging and defiant speeches that I've been privileged to be a part of.
Vanessa, just an observation here. As I was watching this earlier, it looks to me like the majority of the crowd is women and children.
Yes. But largely, I mean, you'll see some of the fighters around the edges of the crowd, but the majority are, as you say, women, children. But also what was extraordinary was to see the Palestinian flags alongside the Hezbollah, alongside the Lebanese flag. So this was total unity of all factions. And this is what we're seeing all the time. These attempts at ISA, at enforcing Israeli dominance and supremacy in the region, both by Saudi Arabia, by the United States, by the UK, by Israel itself, are failing, because what they're working on is generating sectarian divisions, and particularly in Lebanon recently with the faux resignation of Hariri in Saudi Arabia, etc. This was hoped it would create divisions between the sects within Lebanon, but in fact what it's done is unified them, as we see now. With the Al-Quds issue being put back center stage by Trump's decision, what we're actually seeing is a tremendous unification behind Palestine, behind Al-Quds, and against Israeli supremacy. So in fact, their entire project is failing. It's floundering at the moment. And it's floundering because what they've worked on for decades is this sectarianism ploy project. And in fact, now what's happened is there's been a counter-reaction of unification of all those sects. So it's failing dismally. And what we're actually seeing is a risk, I believe, of extinction for not only the illegal state of Israel, but also of Saudi Arabia, because they're putting themselves further and further out onto this brink of isolationism and extremism and supremacism in a region that is now reinforced. It's reinforced by the new global power shift. It's reinforced by the defeat of terrorism, and it's reinforced by a new unification that is happening across the region.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Now, just the protest itself, if anybody wants to have a look at some of the fantastic photographs that Vanessa has taken while she was at that protest on Monday, head over to 21st Century Wire. The headline on this article is "Why Palestine and Al-Quds Are #1 Priority for the Resistance." Now, we're talking about Al-Quds, so let's talk about the statement yesterday. Extraordinary Islamic Summit. This is from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Extraordinary Islamic Summit on Al-Quds calls for internationalizing struggle for peace and imposing political and economic restrictions in response to the US decision. So this is the leaders of 57 Muslim nations calling on the world to recognize the state of Palestine at East Jerusalem as its occupied capital. They're saying that Donald Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital is null and void. They're saying that it is saying that basically Washington has no further role in the Middle East peace process. But the question in my mind, we're talking about the unification of the Muslim world in the Middle East, it seems to a large degree anyway. But Vanessa, where does this leave the situation with Iran? Does this give Iran more influence in the Middle East? And could this be used actually as an excuse by the United States for increased pressure on Iran if they perceive Iran, or if they can argue that Iran is gaining ground in the Middle East with greater influence over many other countries?
Well, the problem is, I think, that they'll always be looking to make that claim regardless of whether Iran is gaining influence or not. But you know, I think I was actually discussing with Shameen Nawani this morning, and we need to turn this on its head. Iran is gaining influence in a region which it is intrinsically connected to, in the same way that the UK has a partnership with the US or with the EU. Why should we be surprised by this, and why should we be against this? It is up to this region, it is up to Yemen, it is up to Syria, it is up to Iraq, it is up to Lebanon to decide who both their trade, their economic and their military partners are, or their defense partners are. They have that right, just as we have that right. You know, Washington has been supplying arms to their chosen client states in the region, which are Saudi Arabia and Israel, for decades, which has led to the destabilization of that region. So I don't think we should even be questioning whether it's a negative that Iran has greater influence in that area. It is up to those countries. It is up to that region to decide whether Iran should have greater influence in that region.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, I can't remember exactly when this was. A couple of days ago, Andrew Mitchell, former Secretary of State for International Development, was appearing on Going Underground with Afshin Rattansi. We've got a couple of clips here, and we'll look at the first one, and then we'll have a comment on it.
Okay, does British policy on Yemen make Britain safer?
Well, I think you have to disaggregate the 2 points you made earlier. One is about the arms sales, so we can deal with that. And the other is about the humanitarian crisis that has developed in Yemen.
So we're giving the aid while exporting lethal weaponry to kill the very same people that we're trying to save?
I think you have to disaggregate the 2 points. And let me explain what I mean by that. Saudi Arabia is surrounded by enemies and is extremely rich. They will always buy weaponry. They'll always get the weaponry. And the weaponry that Britain sells them...
If we don't, somebody else will.
Well, shall I make the point? And therefore, it seems to me that the selling of the weaponry is a second-order issue. If it is legally sent from Britain under an export licensing regime that is the toughest in the world, and it clears those hurdles, then you can take a decision of whether it's right or wrong to supply weapons. But that is a second-order issue because they will get those weapons anyway. The first-order issue is how you stop the attacks on Yemeni civilians, how you address the humanitarian situation.
Before we go on to this second point, you just said someone else will sell it to them. I'm not sure in a court of law, actually, that will pass muster. One NGO, Human Rights in Yemen, is already writing to the Attorney General, Jeremy Wright, saying, no, this is in contravention of any kind of international law.
Well,
Vanessa, this is the argument drug dealers make. If I wasn't providing the drugs, somebody else would. This is incredible. And as Afshin said at the beginning, this is us supplying arms to Saudi Arabia, who are then bombing Yemen, and then we're arguing that we should be putting in humanitarian aid to solve that problem. When it's a problem that we created in the first place.
Well, it's also extraordinary that he uses this term disaggregate twice in this discussion, because you cannot disaggregate the fact that Britain is one of the 3 permanent member states on the UN Security Council that is imposing a fully illegitimate resolution 2216, which is an embargo against 5 named individuals, but is being exploited by the Saudi coalition and its allies in the UK and the US and in France to impose this humanitarian blockade upon the Yemeni people. So from both ends, Britain is putting that pressure on. And so you should aggregate them, because basically what they're doing, what Britain is doing and the US is doing, is maintaining this continuum of misery for the Yemeni people. On one end, what they're doing is allowing the blockade, the humanitarian blockade, and on the other, they're supplying the bombs. And they're not only supplying the bombs, they are in the control and command center in Riyadh, much as they will deny that, and they are actively involved in determining the targets. I mean, they're not going to stand in the command and control center and not have anything to say. They will be determining those civilian targets. We also know now that there is British presence in Aden. We know that they are involving themselves on a much deeper level than previously. So, I mean, this was a complete, even the way that he almost described Saudi Arabia in the way that Israel is often described as being the victim and needing to defend itself against all its enemies in the region. I mean, this is an extraordinary argument that was used here. If we don't supply the weapons, somebody else will. But they didn't. Out of that sentence came no desire to end the supply of weapons to this client state that is financing and arming terrorism globally. So we're not only talking about Yemen here. We're also talking about what is happening in the region, in Syria, in Iraq, etc. I mean, it's just for a senior politician to come out with a statement like this is diabolical.
Absolutely. Well, it got better, of course.
What do you make of seeing the fact that President Assad's position in Damascus, assured, it seems to be, and all these years, and all these millions, hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British money, where did it all go?
The British taxpayers' money has been absolutely vital in keeping alive and sustaining one of the world's other worst humanitarian crises to the European Union added together.
That may be the case,
spending of British money is absolutely vital.
Better to be
preventative.
Okay, but better to be preventative. I mean, we have a report here. We have a leaked memo from the Conflict Stability Security Fund talking about 200 million going to all manner of different activities, which don't seem anything to do with trying to create peace. They seem to be supporting Islamists in Syria.
Well, I think that
will they be returning home to do harm here in Britain?
That is a highly doubtful statistic. Britain has been working.
I have the leaked memo here. 18 million in peace, but 32 million being given to moderate armed groups, 54 million to the White Helmets, which has now been linked to ISIS, Daesh, and Al-Qaeda linked groups.
The White Helmets very nearly won a Nobel Peace Prize.
And
the White House. I know that the
so
Russians,
did Henry Kissinger.
I know the Russians think that the White Helmets are an Islamist front, but actually the clear evidence that we had in Britain was that the White Helmets were incredibly brave men and women in Syria going to the rescue of people under attack from Russian and regime bombs.
Vanessa, are you Russian?
No, I'm not Russian. But I mean, wasn't this extraordinary? I mean, if you watch body language here, the minute that the White Helmets is mentioned, you can almost see the script ping into his head, right? Because we go immediately into these brave men and women. You know, they nearly won a Nobel Peace Prize, and Afshin very quickly puts in, so did Kissinger, and for that matter, so did Obama. And then we go into this entire script. I mean, I should honestly get together all of these people talking about the White Helmets, and I can show that they have literally been given a script from which they're reading every time they have an interview on the White Helmets. They never deviate from these certain facts, men and women pulling people out from under the rubble, 100,000 people saved. Well, who is documenting and archiving and recording these supposed victims that have been saved by the White Helmets? But the sheer hypocrisy to sit there and say that British taxpayers' money is being used to ease the humanitarian crisis. It's not. It is going. I mean, the BBC Panorama programme, which only literally tickled the surface of what Britain is actually funding among the terrorist entities that are operating inside Syria. But nevertheless, it did touch on that surface. And Afshin read out figures which have been detailed of what exactly the Conflict Stability and Security Fund is going to, which entities it's going to within Syria. And all of those entities can be proven to be connected to terrorist organizations, led by terrorist organizations, populated by terrorist organizations inside Syria. So, I mean, this is just an extraordinary obfuscation by a Tory politician over the fact that the Tory government has been funding the war in Syria, which is a failed war, with probably well over 200 million of taxpayers' money,
but
while
not just
imposing austerity in the UK.
Yeah, and not just any ordinary Tory politician either, an ex-Secretary of State for International Development, so he knows exactly what's been going on.
Yeah, and in fact, I think he was recently quoted saying that DFID, the Department for International Development, was made in his image. In other words, his influence upon it is still seen today. So even though I think he created it back in, I could be wrong here, 2010, 2011, he basically made a statement in 2016 saying that what he created is still very much as he created it. So he was, and remember that the paperwork that we found in East Aleppo linking Adam Smith and Integrity Consulting to the terrorist organizations was from 2014. So at that point, it was through DFID. It wasn't through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. So, the evidence is becoming unavoidable, and yet they're still avoiding it, and they're still avoiding addressing it.
Absolutely. Okay, look, Vanessa, we're out of time, so thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay.
It's been very interesting. We'll get you on maybe before we break for the Christmas break, and keep us posted with how it's going in Lebanon. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Okay, before we move on, let's just have a quick advertisement. Tonight, Ian Crane is in the studio, and at 7:30 he will be having episode 100 of Humanity versus Insanity, and at 2100 at 9 p.m, Fracking Nightmare as usual. This will be the last Crane programmes before the Christmas break, but do get to watch those, ukcolumn.org/live, if you get the chance. Now, the European Council summit is taking place today. Theresa May, as we mentioned, was defeated in the House of Commons yesterday, and Parliament will now have a vote on the final so-called Brexit agreement. But I wonder what's on the agenda for the European Council meeting today. Let's find out what Donald Tusk had to say.
Let me start, if you allow me. Good afternoon, first of all. The summit is a very clear illustration of the fact that only when we are united can we successfully perform even the most difficult issues and tasks. Like with European defense, for example, or with Brexit. Today we are launching PESCO, an ambitious, inclusive and very pragmatic project in the field of defense. And tomorrow we also formally will end our first phase of the Brexit negotiations. Both these achievements demanded courage, realism, but above all, our unity. And, by the way, I have no doubts that the real test of our unity will be the second phase of the Brexit talks.
And I'm going to say welcome to the programme to Alex Thompson at this point. Alex, just got a few other things to say in that little doorstep as he arrived at the European Council meeting this morning. But the key point from the first part of it was A, the launching of PESCO, and B, the idea that Europe that he is seeing unity within European nations. And of course, with regard to PESCO, that seems to be the case because now we've got 25 member states signed up to that out of the 28. But he went on following that to say that in the areas of fiscal union and banking union, there isn't the same unity, and we're going to come on to that in a second. But it's almost like he's, here's a man who doth protest too much. I get the impression he's not quite certain of unity in this.
I definitely detected the same hesitancy and abashedness in him, Mike, which is untypical of him because he's got far better English than most senior Eurocrats. He even got difficult word order right there. Only such and such can we instead of we can. So that makes it all the stranger when he's performing at that level of English that there is so much hemming and hawing involved. I think the key to it is the two giveaway words. Courage, as in British politics, so in European, means treason. It means betraying your electorate, and that's what you need the so-called courage for. So it means behaving like an elite. That's what courage means. And the second buzzword there was unity, at which you could see Mr. Tusk really come into his stride and start gloating, because with this chuckle on his face as he said unity, he really meant bullying. And I think the particular bullying he means is having told neutral Ireland and Portugal that you jolly well will join in PESCO. They still haven't got Malta in because it doesn't have any particular exemptions, but it has such a volatile political and migration situation that it might be too hot to handle for the European Military Union at the moment. But yes, you can see that the same emphasis is being carried forward into banking union. And there, the bullying is going to be the Eurocrats against the German people and the populist German parties of left and right, because the Germans, as you've noticed before, have woken up to the fact that there's going to be a treasury, and this will make the European Union a permanent transfer union, as in the United States, with the richer member states annually providing subsidies to the poorer, which never get repaid.
Well, you've made some interesting points there, Alex. Now I'm just going to echo some of that, because this was some of the text from his invitation letter to the heads of state or government for this European Council summit. And he said, our unity in recent months has been outstanding. We have demonstrated that we stand firmly together. The best example of this will be the launch of the new cooperation in European defence. That's PESCO. And again, he is concerned that there are divisions, though he goes on to be concerned about divisions, potential divisions, particularly with regard to financial union, where he sees divisions north to south, and also with migration, where he sees divisions east to west. But if you remember, you're talking about bullying, and if you remember a couple of weeks ago, when he was giving his briefing on the sort of State of the Nation address, he was saying, when it comes to the European Union, banking union and fiscal union, that he is not going to tolerate anybody standing in the way of the effective creation of a European Treasury. And he said he intends to have that done by June next year. And he said he would name and shame anybody who stood in his way. It was it was pretty strong language, and something I've never heard from a so-called diplomat before.
No, and this is the problem with the Polish elite of whatever political persuasion. They have this arrogance and chauvinism in them, which is often underrated or sometimes even consciously exploited by Anglo-American French elites, because they are the representatives, as it were, the best kid in the class from the Eastern Bloc. So they represent the interests of the Western banking elite to the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. And he's definitely got the ability to get the knives out. And also he's, like a lot of German and Polish politicians, he has this curious fusion of interest. You see it between the Netherlands and Germany as well. where Prime Minister Rutte is openly being accused by some parties of lining himself up for a job in the next European Commission, which will enter office 2019, and so it's being basically assembled now in secret. And Rutte has made no secret of the fact he wants a role, perhaps even the chairmanship or the presidency. And with that in mind, they're almost thinking along the lines of the German elite, German deep state, already these neighbouring countries. That's why they're putting their military assets and their banking assets into the German pot. Germany is pushing southwards and eastwards with the migration question, but when it comes to sharing the burden of the fiscal union, it is also aggressively pushing northwards and westwards to its fellow Germanic countries, the Netherlands, and particularly Denmark and Sweden, which have both kept the krona, their own crowns, as currencies. And that is something which Denmark has an opt-out for, Sweden doesn't. And Sweden has to prove year on year by fudging its figures that it's not supposedly met the convergence criteria when it jolly well knows it has. So Sweden in particular is going to be forced to do that, because another reason for that, of course, is euro creation centrally, ultimately from the Bank for International Settlements above the level of the European Central Bank. That allows some figures, say 4,000 to 6,000 euros per head of population, including migrants on the territory. And so Sweden, with a massive surplus of migrants out of work and so on, is going to see a large release of fiat currencies if Sweden ever enters the Eurozone, which will help to balance the books or fudge things for a bit longer.
Now, the situation is with this European Council meeting that Theresa May will attend today. There's going to be a round table on European defence. There's going to be a working dinner on European defence. Tomorrow, I believe Theresa May is not going to be there, because the two meetings that are taking place tomorrow are for the EU 27, not the 28. And the first is a Euro summit, so talking about the issues that Alex has just been speaking about. And then the Brexit roundtable, which is really the formal ratification by the other 27 member states of the agreement that's been done already, and we've already talked about earlier this week. And they're also going to look at things like migration and so on, as we've said. Now, of course, the big feature of this European Council meeting is PESCO. We had the notification document signed by the 23 earlier in the month. Then we had Ireland and Portugal joining on the 7th of December. And then on the 11th, we had the formal ratification of the notification. So they have all formally agreed to do that. There's been another signing ceremony. And here we go. Today, PESCO is actually being launched. So let's look at the British government reaction to that, because, of course, we are not joining at this point in time. And Alex, this is another letter, this time written by Earl Howe, who's he's deputy to Mr. Gavin Williamson. So he is a defence minister, and he's saying pretty explicitly that our future relationship with the EU will be that of a third party.
Yes, and in the context of the paragraph, one would read that reassurance to the MP to give back to the constituent as if a way of saying, don't worry, we'll be totally outside it. But of course it isn't, because both EU and British government documents, particularly from the Department for Exiting the European Union, their September position paper, which is quoted by David Ellis in his recent submission at the top of ukcolumn.org/defence, these make it clear that third party is a formal European Union and particularly defence planning, defence industry planning term. And third party means a country which, like Norway in most EU purposes, is part of the club but doesn't help to set the rules, but does pay some of the dues. So it's basically a colonial status, as David Scott put it not too strongly last week. So it's actually an acknowledgement. Earl Howe is lying through his hat here. He knows jolly well what he's saying is Britain will be locked in and will have less say than a member of the European Union.
And in fact, the European Union has no choice, because as the Henry Jackson Society, you have headlined this, even neocons admit Britain has overpaid. But the point here is that Britain is making up some of the shortfalls of other European countries in terms of defence budget.
Yes, and the main reason for that, as even the Henry Jackson Society say with its, as you see the subtitle there, is their Global Britain programme. So these are the people from the banking world driving the idea that Britain should stay in the world and have its soft power thrown around within blocks like the EU and the Commonwealth. these people are having to admit Britain is one of the 4 countries that has a 1/6 share, a 16% share of the bill for the European Investment Bank, which funds all these alphabet soup of defence initiatives. But unlike the 3 other top whack payers, which is France, Germany and Italy, we continue to pay our 2% commitment to NATO and pretend to be a first-rank power. Well, France does too, but it's paid slightly less. So the Germans are the biggest deficit in all this. They are, on paper, they pay it the same as the other big boys, as it were. But there's nearly 100 billion euros, if I'm correct in understanding it, shortfall in what they are paying as against what they should be paying, as particularly in the NATO terms. And Donald Trump made a point of saying this, even in a speech at Pensacola, Florida on the 7th of December, saying to the public that he told Mrs. Merkel this would never go on again. So actually we're paying more. And this is why David Ellis's submission was quite right in saying in some ways we will be the prime contributor to this European military union after we supposedly leave the EU.
One British newspaper did pick this up, and that was the Express. And it said UK props up EU's defence with 17 billion as Germany, Italy and France fail to meet NATO targets. And it goes on to discuss this Henry Jackson Society article. But having done that, they then published this article on today's European Council summit. And their headline is EU Summit, Ireland and France set to dictate future of Britain. And Alex, have a wild stab in the dark at how many times the word defence is used in this article.
That wouldn't be a big fat zero by any chance, would it,
would
Mike?
Indeed, yes, that would be exactly correct. So, I have asked this before, I'm going to ask again. Is there a D-notice? Is there some kind of restriction on the mainstream press in Britain covering the issue of European defence? Because they are not covering it at all in terms of, the Express does cover some aspects of it, but in terms of what the events that are happening on a day-to-day basis, they're not covering it in any of their. If there's a European meeting where PESCO or some other aspect of European defence is being discussed, it is never mentioned in any of the articles about those European summits or European meetings, and the same goes for UK government press releases. Alex, I find this is. What is it? They are lying by omission here. It's fake news, is it not?
Yes, fake news and mendacious. And there's only 3 reasons why you see universal failure by the press to cover something. There's either command, complicity, or just consensus. So command would be the D-notice. Complicity is that they've actually conspired not to do it. And these 2 are possible, quite possible. And I would perhaps slightly prefer find more likely the idea that there's simply a consensus that they all eat from this pot. And so like continental journalists do formally, so British journalists have done informally. They've said, well, we're all part of this caste which benefits from the EU, which is how the EU was set up in the first place, to have rent-seeking people, all the middle classes working for it. And so let's form a compact not to talk about this, because in one sense, if they do, it's more than their job's worth, and in another sense, they know that they're out of their depth. It's rather like the fact that the BBC will never ever, even in its so-called debunking unit, it will never mention UK column. And I've got some confidence in saying, even if we screamed a lot louder and grew our audience share, they still would never mention us. They couldn't afford to, because people would start looking at what we have to say.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, look, let's move on to war internationally, or the potential for it. And this is quite a headline from the Asia Times. John Lehman, China, Russia, Iran threaten new Pearl Harbor.
So this was the Secretary for the Navy in the late Reagan era, and so he's getting on a bit now, but he's got some good points to make, very much like our own Brian Gerrish has found since retiring from the Navy, which is that with the generation handover, which is affecting the military and the civil service in many ways, the expertise is being lost. But people can freeze that later and read it. The points he's making are, we've had a string of accidents. Okay, some people think that there's Russian and Chinese ECMs involved in these, but even if you just leave it at the level of, a comedy of errors, well, not a comedy because people have died and drowned in the ocean, but a series of errors may have caused this. Even if you keep it at that level, then the human reason for the errors, just staying within the US Navy's Pacific Fleet, is people being over-promoted, not enough of the senior guys, particularly the NCO level, which runs an Army, Navy and Air Force, and which is deliberately targeted, like the similar ranks in the police, the sergeants and inspectors. So there's some undermining going on. The most worrying thing is Mr. Lehman is warning of a Pearl Harbor, but the whole point about that is that the first time Pearl Harbor happened, it was allowed to happen. A lie-hop let it happen on purpose. I think everyone, all serious historians accept that now. It was claimed by more and more over the decades, and it's now known pretty much for certain with declassified decrypts. And so the fear is that if this language is being used, and again with the project for a new American century also talking about new Pearl Harbors, then what we're looking at is perhaps, as we were talking about yesterday, Mike, in another context, a desire in Western elite circles to start World War III and get away with it.
Let's look at another direction that they're attacking this, because we highlighted this as it happened. This is the Joint Strategic Exercise Zapad 2017, and the hysteria, the absolute hysteria over this when it happened earlier this year. Russian exercise taking place mainly in Belarus. The NATO Review has published this article, Zapad 2017 and Euro-Atlantic Security, and they say since 2008, Russia has used its strategic exercises and large-scale SNAP exercises to hone its military capabilities, undermine regional stability and peace, and twice, first in Georgia and then in Ukraine, to mask impending aggression. Exercise Zapad 2017 was the latest iteration of such exercises. The main focus is the claim that Russia deliberately underestimates the number of troops taking part in exercises in order to avoid attracting foreign observers. That's the main claim that they're making in this. And they say that Russian troops remained on the Georgian border after exercise Kavkaz ended on the 2nd of August 2008, and a force estimated at approximately 40,000 troops started operations on Georgian territory on the 7th of August, halting under international pressure 5 days later on the outskirts of Tbilisi. Alex, is that a fair statement of what took place?
No, in a word. I was following those troop movements and they weren't there. I really don't know where they're getting that from. Are they suggesting that the Russians made the Ossetian War happen on purpose? Famously, President Putin was in Peking for the Olympics, and he had to come back in a hurry. And there's footage of him with genuine shock and rage on his face, putting his face up to the cameras, the official Russian presidency cameramen who were with him, and saying, "Stop! These women are too distraught at the loss of their menfolk." There's nothing faked about that. Everyone was taken by surprise, including arguably the Georgian Defense Minister, David Kezarashvili, who was out of the country. So that's completely pulled out of someone's wrong orifice, I'm afraid. That it's taken them 9 years to come up with this.
Absolutely. But it's much worse than it seems, because they're actually saying that this was premeditated, that Russia only held its exercise in that place so that it could then pop across the border and do what it did. It's incredible. They then go on to say, Exercise Zapad 2017 officially conducted on NATO's eastern borders in Russian Western Military District and on the territory of Belarus from the 14th to 20th of September was the latest iteration of the exercise series, thus linked to Europe's first war of the 21st century. And they're saying that that's the Georgian War. They link to a document on the Georgian War. Now, this table is what they use to represent their claim. And they're showing various Russian exercises, including the 3 Zapad exercises and the most recent one, Zapad 2017. And they're saying that the Russian Ministry of Defense announced 12,700 participating troops on Zapad 2017, but they are estimating that the true number of participating troops for Zapad 2017 was 60,000 to 70,000. Well, even that's significantly less than the 120,000 that they were getting all hysterical about at the time. But it is an incredible thing. They go on to say in this article, the strategic nature of Zapad was highlighted by a simulated defense of the Moscow region by S-400 air defense interceptors against a mass cruise missile attack. Dual-capable conventional and nuclear precision strike capability was also a major element of Zapad, including SS-21 Scarab and SS-26 Iskander missile unit activity, with live firing in other regions by Iskander units not stationed in the Western Military District. The Ministry of Defense also reported extensive exercise activity by chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defense units, underscoring the Russian Armed Forces' ability to operate in a CBRN-contaminated environment. The exercise activities were conducted in 2 phases, a first defensive and counter-offensive phase, followed by a transition to a second offensive phase. NATO spokesperson Oana Lungescu consequently said that, quote, in effect, all these activities together constituted a single strategic exercise. Zapad was clearly a large-scale state-on-state conflict. And the article goes on to say the character, scale and intensity of Russian military exercise activities during September 2017 is consistent with the system of strategic operations that Russia would conduct in conflict with NATO, focusing on the Western strategic direction and supporting military activity nationwide in all strategic directions and potential global operations in an escalating conflict. The response by NATO collectively and allied nations individually was far from the hysteria of which Moscow accused them. And so it goes on. The hysteria in this article is fantastic. And they say, Alex, that the NATO declarations, this is how they end it, they say that the NATO declarations from both Wales and Warsaw were great examples of NATO's response to all this. But in fact, Alex, those NATO declarations from both Wales and Warsaw were hysterical. The Wales declaration, for example, mentions Russia 45 times. Russia's mentioned 59 times in the Warsaw Declaration, including in Clause 11, which says NATO has responded to this changed security environment by enhancing its deterrence and defence posture, including by a forward presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and by suspending all practical civilian and military cooperation between NATO and Russia, while remaining open to political dialogue with Russia. We reaffirm these decisions. So this continuing hysteria over this, plus the fact that they have suspended all practical civilian and military cooperation with Russia, this can really only end in one direction, surely.
A pre-planned outcome, I'm afraid, Mike. Deliberately, defence intelligence has been slashed in the English-speaking countries and France and so on, particularly in Britain. They were told actually they would have to shed as many men as they needed to vacate one of their buildings in Whitehall to be flogged off. That's how haphazard it was. And these men were bean counters who knew every last piece of equipment in foreign armies. And so now we have politicians who in many cases have never been east of Vienna, never held a rifle, trying to discern or pre-script before the military men get involved, trying to pre-script these communiques at NATO summits. But what you showed on screen makes it quite clear. There's a 4-year roulement in Russia of combined arms, large-scale exercises. The names of them, Zapad, Center, Vostok, Kavkaz, simply mean Western, Central, Eastern, and Caucasus. And it's a 4-year plan, which only Russia needs because there's no other country geographically like Russia in the world. It's a 4-year way of making sure that they can't get invaded by Germany, can't get invaded by the Turks, can't get invaded by the US through Central Asia, and can't get invaded by the Chinese. They have nasty histories with all 4 elements coming to the fore, and with local allies, anti-Russian peoples being stoked up in all of those areas. There's no comparison between that and, for example, an island nation or a nation with effectively its own continent. That's the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. How can we possibly compare? Even France, which is a continental nation but with friends on all sides. There's no way we can compare the way we do our military readiness with the way the Russians, as Peter Hitchens says, with these indefensible planes, particularly on the west and also towards China, and with repeated experiences of having world wars launched against them. That it only stands to reason that the Russians keep themselves in readiness.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's just quickly move through a couple more items here. First thing to mention, of course, is that this is the 6-month anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire. And in order to commemorate that, there was a service taking place at 11 o'clock this morning in St Paul's Cathedral. They were expecting about 1,500 people to attend that, including representation from the government and the royal family. And it's designed, according to St Paul's website here, to remember those who died, to show solidarity with the bereaved and survivors, and to give thanks for everyone who assisted on the ground at the time of the tragedy. Well, I would just like to say that, of course, we would maintain or reiterate our solidarity with the bereaved and the survivors, and we will do everything that we can to help with that. Alex, have you any brief thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do feel guilty that we haven't been able to report more on Grenfell, but it's such a stew on the ground, and we don't want to be stoking any tensions because there's already so much mutual suspicion among some of the survivors and their relatives, quite understandably. So we want to make sure that what we report is solid and also that it has the support of the local community. But we certainly haven't forgotten about this. I noticed that Lady Leisha, a very big rapper, not my kind of music at all, but in her latest rap, Queen's Speech 7, she has this question, who stood up when Grenfell? And then she asks where Theresa May spent all the money that was raised for Grenfell. So that's become, at least in the black community, a nationwide international issue now.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to end on this one because the Secretary of State has appointed a new chair to Ofcom, Lord Terry Burns. Lord Burns is very pleased to have the opportunity to take this role, apparently. Well, this appointment has been made in accordance with the Cabinet Office's Governance Code of Public Appointments, so we can all rest assured that that's a good decision. Apparently, the chair of Ofcom was appointed by the Secretary of State. Remuneration for the role is £120,000 for up to 3 days a week, so that three days a week. So that might be half a day. It could be 2 days. We don't really know. The term of the appointment is 4 years. So who is Lord Burns? Well, he's got quite an interesting background. He was on the Lords Speakers Committee on the size of the House of Lords, so he's into constitutional reform. He's been on the Economic Affairs Committee. He's been on the Trade Union Political Funds and Political Party Funding Committee. He's been on the Economic Affairs Committee, Financial Services and Markets Joint Committee, and he's been on the Monetary Policy Committee for the Bank of England. Professionally, well, he's most recently been chairman of Channel 4 Television. He's been chairman of Marks & Spencer's PLC. He's been a non-executive director for Banco Santander. He's been a chairman for Santander UK PLC. And he's been involved in a number of other companies, including Pearson Group, Pearson PLC. And he's also been chairman of the Freedom of Information Commission, a non-executive member of the Office for Budget Responsibility. He's been chairman of Structural Review of the Football Association. He's been an independent advisor to the Secretary of State for the BBC Charter Review. He's been a chairman of the National Lottery Commission. He's been a chairman of the Committee for the Inquiry into the Impact of Hunting with Dogs in England and Wales. He's been permanent secretary to HM Treasury. He's been a chief economic advisor to HM Treasury and head of the Government Economic Service. So he's done rather a lot. But I thought it was interesting that he was chairman of Santander PLC. And while he was chairman of Santander, he was happy to sign this document, which is the report, the Corporate Social Responsibility Report for 2010 for Santander. As we scan down through that, we discover that they are supporting education. Apparently, the new Santander Education Fund provided funding of over £1 million to projects addressing financial capability in the secondary and further education sectors through a series of new partnerships with lead national charities and third sector organisations. Santander were providing long-term support for financial education to help increase financial awareness and capability for young people and to fund materials for disadvantaged groups. And so that was a £1 million pot. And well, look, one of the organisations being funded was our old friend Common Purpose, who were running front-runner courses specifically targeted at disabled students to help develop their leadership skills and equip them to be on UK public policy boards. It was a residential course, 400 young disabled people taking training in 2011. So, Alex, this is a great person to have in charge of Ofcom, in charge of regulating the press and the media in this country.
Clearly, he's come into it because of his abiding passion for communications and his specialism in the broadcasting industry, given the list you read out. But no, banks, and he is obviously a bank man, at least second-hand, they love education, re-education, and reframing, including communication, because that creates the tabula rasa, the blank slate of mankind, which the very tops of the banks want to have. Without any sense of history or identity. And at the very top, this is why the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations has, according to two good sources, Dr. John Coleman and Daniel Estulin, been used by the Bank for International Settlements as its laboratory to come up with ways of erasing mankind's history and starting afresh. So that's the top level of this.
Yep. Well, we said right at the beginning of the programme that we would discuss Sky News, so we're going to end with this because this is all about Murdoch and Fox and the deal, because Disney has apparently closed in, according to Sky News, on the $60 billion Fox deal. So what's this about? Well, basically they're selling off 20th Century Fox Film Studio. They're also selling off US cable networks like FX, National Geographic Channel, as well as international pay television assets, including Star TV in India. But it also includes Fox's 39.1 stake in Sky PLC, the owner of Sky News. So, Alex, just to close the show, I just thought it was really appropriate that Sky News should be owned by Disney because most of what they put out these days is no more than a fairy tale.
Well observed, Mike. And the ever-alert Martin Edwards has pointed out, meanwhile, that Pearson, our lead partners in the United Nations, tell everyone about the Global Goals campaign. And Pearson sit alongside the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in that work. If people haven't watched last Friday's broadcast, go back and find David Scott talking about his wife Leslie's article about the third sector. These guys, as Leslie warns, are in danger of being seen as the enemy rather than our servants.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, thank you very much, Alex. Thank you to Vanessa for earlier. Thank you for watching. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. If you like what we're doing and you'd like to support us, please consider taking out a membership or making a donation. We can't do what we do without your help, so that would be much appreciated. And we will see you at 1 p.m. tomorrow. And I'll be joined by David Scott. See you then. Bye-bye.